You're watching The Fix with me, Karima Brown. Now, several economists have called on President Cyril Ramaphosa to scale up the economic lifeline to working class and poor South Africans, urging him to use COVID-19 and the crisis as a result of that as an opportunity to usher in more pro-poor policies. To talk about this, I'm joined via Skype by economist Lumkile Monde, as well as Neil Coleman from the Centre for Economic Justice. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me via Skype. Neil Coleman, let me start off with you. You heard the Deputy Finance Minister saying that they are working on a document that they are putting before Cabinet on Thursday. This is now Treasury. But the Deputy Minister was very wishy-washy when I put some of the concrete proposals contained in the document by the 150 economists, such as a COVID-19 grant or topping up the existing grant for a basic income grant, and even extending benefits to casual workers. Are you encouraged by the fact that they are putting this document together, or do you think it's going to be more of the same?
One's quite concerned, Karima, that the extent of the crisis that we're in is not being acknowledged in terms of the scale of the responses. If we look at the scale of the responses internationally, for example, in the BRICS countries, we're talking about rescue packages of about 7.9% of GDP. In South Africa, the calculation is that our rescue package is about 0.1%. So in relation to the size of the shock that the economy is facing, which some people estimate could be between 6 and 10% at this point, the size of the package has to be commensurate with the shock that our economy is experiencing. And therefore, while we welcome some of the measures which government has embarked on, they are far too small to meet the scale of the crisis. 80% of the economy is shutting down. We were in a recession already when the crisis hit. We are now heading for a deep economic depression. So the real question is, what is the scale of the interventions that is required? A lot of governments around the world were in denial about the extent of the crisis and what needed to be done. But you found very rapidly that reality took over, and they realized that they had to keep businesses going, they had to keep workers employed, they had to assist the vulnerable. And the extent of our interventions is just far too small at this point. So it's quite worrying that Treasury in particular is sticking to old, sort of fairly narrow orthodox approaches, when even business economists like Brian Cantor, who spoke in the IEJ webinar this week, Ricardo Hausmann, the Financial Times, are saying that existing fiscal and monetary rules need to be thrown out the window, and that we need to do everything that we can, borrow as much as we can, print money if we need to. Inflation isn't an issue at the moment, in order to finance a response on the scale that is required.
All right, let me bring Lumkile in. Lumkile, do you agree with Neil that we need to throw orthodoxy out the window and take the bull by the horns and see this crisis for what it really is, and think outside of the box and go for new policy positions?
Karima, good morning, and good morning to Neil and your viewers. It's important for us to focus on life, South Africans, putting people first. We know that we are excluded in South Africa, millions outside the labor market and are marginalized. And they are the ones that are going to be the biggest victims of COVID-19. So therefore, our focus should be on them, making sure that to put a basic income grant across. So yes, I agree with me that times are different. We need to go big to save South African lives.
Now, you have worked in, state institutions and development finance institutions. The Deputy Finance Minister is talking about a document that will be presented to Cabinet on Thursday. He was not committing to some of the proposals, outrightly. For example, extending, worker rights and guarantees to people in the informal and casual labour sector. We know that many South Africans work in that sector, or the BIG, except to say that that nothing is off the table. Are you confident, Lumkile, that the government of President Ramaphosa, under the leadership in financial terms of Tito Mboweni, will seize the moment to introduce those kinds of policy changes that you believe is the only response to this pandemic?
Not at all. I think they've got a very poor track record of following through. Remember, Karima, in the period between 1990 and 94, we worked very, very hard across our society, mobilizing every citizen on a new economic policy, which was encapsulated in the Reconstruction and Development Program. They did not consider it, nor do they consider the macroeconomic group, which was a group of academics that are progressive, that were NC members. Their recommendations were dumped. So in the past 10 years, they've raided public resources for their individual interests. So therefore, what we're seeing is really President Ramaphosa's government trying to rectify in these structural reforms they're talking about, rectifies what was supposed to have been done in the past 10 years and they propose resources. So I'm not confident. I think they need to look at our proposal much more seriously and think differently by putting South African people first, particularly African people who remain very poor, marginalized and hungry.
Neil, let me bring you in here. When I asked the Deputy Finance Minister about food security, one of the proposals in the document is a much more concentrated effort around food security. And his answer wasn't actually, very satisfying or very detailed, except to say that, they are working with social development and food parcels are being given. If you look at the existing measures that are there, is that sufficient to deal with what is surely going to become food hunger pretty soon in South Africa?
Yes, Karima, I think one worries that, a lot of the initiatives in this sort of area are being driven at provincial and local level. You need a massive government intervention which is well-resourced, which deals with the fact that a large grouping of the poor are going to be driven into destitution. And what that means is starvation, is people are not going to have enough food to survive. So people are being left with a choice. Do you avoid coronavirus or do you avoid starvation? And these are not the choices which our people should have to make. Therefore, a massive drive of providing food to people needs to be embarked on, and that needs resources. And currently, unfortunately, the resources which are being dedicated to this are very small. I think one of the other things, Karima, is that there's currently a focus, correctly, on the most vulnerable, on the unemployed, on the poorest workers and the informal economy. But actually, if you look at that graphic which you showed earlier, 80% of South Africans, according to research, are not in a position to make preparations to deal with this crisis. If they lose their jobs, so-called people in the middle class are one or two checks away from poverty. So this is going to affect 50 million South Africans. It's not going to affect a marginal grouping of South Africans. And therefore, again, the question of the scale of the intervention becomes important. Things like a basic income grant, access to income security for all South Africans becomes absolutely critical in a moment like this.
Lumkile, there has been the case made for the fact that South Africa is in fact bankrupt, that we don't have the money. Unlike developed economies, we don't have that kind of fiscal room to provide, for example, the cushioning that commercial banks need so that they can give people bank holidays, another proposal that's in this document. Do you agree with that, take on our economy, that we simply don't have the money to make the kind of decisions that is contained in this document?
So, Karima, we know very well that there's a lot of money around. Just yesterday, my asset manager took a lot of money out of my account, which is my savings for the future. So domestically, there's a lot of resources that lie with asset managers and institutions. The Reserve Bank has got huge reserves that in an emergency condition that we're in could be tapped upon to address the problems. So we need to focus on domestic resources, to focus on domestic savings and use those to better people's lives, to address this problem. So the issue that Neil is raising around the basic income grant becomes very critical, because if we can really make sure that not even one South African at least goes on hunger, or we don't lose massive number of people, we invest in people. I think after the COVID-19 pandemic is gone, or at least to an extent defeated, then we can start looking at ways of now reconstructing the economy. That requires a completely different orthodoxy from the current orthodoxy of the Treasury, which seems to stick to prudential regulation, try to appease financial institutions. The times are now different. If we're going to build an economy, that economy must focus on well-being, putting South Africans at the center of any economic development.
Neil, one of the things that people are proposing is, of course, different kinds of regulations around capital outflows. Is the government's existing regulations adequate, given the kind of volatility globally and just the way in which, the South African currency has been taking a beating, in the international markets?
No, the regulations aren't adequate, Karima. Since 1994, a lot of the controls which were put in place to regulate financial flows have been lifted. And that was how many of our large corporations were able to list offshore, et cetera, leaving aside the debate of whether that was correct or not. At this stage, institutions like the IMF, mainstream business papers like the Financial Times and so on, are saying that developing countries need capital controls. And the simple reason for that is that there's been an outflow of over R1 trillion since in the last couple of months, which is greater than that outflow that happened in the global financial crisis, an outflow from developing countries. So there's a need for speed bumps and other forms of capital controls which slow down these speculative capital flows. But importantly, we also need to do things to keep our businesses going, because although the basic income grant is important, we need to ensure that businesses have access to capital, that their requirements in terms of repayments, paying rent, et cetera. We've seen a lot of these requirements in the developed world to assist businesses in tiding themselves over during this crisis. The critical thing, though, is that those must be attached to a requirement that the workers remain employed as long as that assistance is given. So it's really about a combination of policy tools. It's not that one policy tool can do everything. We need the capital controls, we need the basic income grant.
We have to leave it there. Thank you, Neil. Thank you, Lumkile. Of course, all eyes on the Treasury and Cabinet as they put their plan to the executive on Thursday. Of course, the South African economic stimulus package, a key, mechanism to deal with COVID-19. Well, you've had your fix for this week. See you again next Sunday. Please take care, be safe. Thank you for watching.